to me, it's one of the most beautiful and intense experiences to build something, a very bold mission with a very driven team. And in between my two companies, I basically also spend a bit of time in just purely doing angel investing, and I like that as well, but I need the adrenaline, and I want to be on the field and actually do, not just, sit on the stadium. I want to, score the goal myself, so to speak.
This episode is brought to you by WHU, the Otto Beisheim School of Management. WHU is reshaping the way students learn about business, management, finance, and entrepreneurship through its innovative programs and partnerships in Germany and across the globe. To learn more about this globally ranked university, visit whu.edu today.
Hey folks, Gerrit here. Welcome to the latest episode of the Most Awesome Founder Podcast. We are here in Berlin with Christian Gaiser, founder of Numa, not Numa Stays, which is their domain. Christian, of course, is a WHU alum and a very impressive founder. We're very much looking forward to hearing his story today.
Coming to you from WHU on the banks of the Rhine River in beautiful Vallendar, Germany. This is the best and most awesome founder podcast. A show about entrepreneurs, innovators, advisors, and educators, and the stories that make them who they are today.
Christian, welcome.
Thank you, Gerrit. Excited to be on the show, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's I think your story is a compelling and an interesting one, another incredible high-growth venture out of the WHU ecosystem, and a topic that is near and dear to my heart as well, because you're in the business of doing the things that I love to do the most.
So which is what, traveling or experiencing, discovering, or?
Well, that's it. I think I love that you use that word experiences, right? Because I personally, and I think many other people these days have this ethos that I personally would rather spend my money on experiences rather than things.
For sure. I think that's a big theme. And I think I always like to say to our team or to our investors that we're pretty much in the business of delivering emotions and experiences, because what we're selling is accommodation, so people stay with us for several days, for weeks, sometimes even months, and that's a very emotional experience. You have a very big attachment to it, and actually there's this saying in the industry that the joy that you experience before your actual travel trip is among the highest intensity levels that you can experience, because you build up all this initial expectation level, and that's a beautiful business and industry to be in, but of course you have to meet the expectations of your guests.
Right. And I know, as someone that worked in the tourism industry much of my young life, right, it's
I did not know this.
Yeah, I was a ski instructor, river guide for all through college, and lived in mountain towns most of my life, and so saw many of those beautiful experiences that visitors would have, and then also saw those experiences where people put so much energy and expectation into things that they were frankly stressed out as a result of it, and so much of it could be impacted by the people that were facilitating those experiences, and the outcomes is not necessarily just a trip or an adventure, but those experiences lead to wisdom and growth and so many incredible things that can come from that.
100%. I mean, it's a mix between, being transparent in terms of what you can deliver, but then also managing expectations. And like I said, it's a very emotional experience. If someone, visited you and in the mountain resort and went on a, skiing exercise with you, that was a very, I assume, intense experience, right? Something they have been looking for months, most likely. And I think that's a very beautiful guest journey to cover, right? And I think that's something that really excites me, and because there's so much you can optimize in that industry. But I guess we're going to get to that a bit later. Yeah.
Yes, but let's first get to you. As I told you offline, we like to start all of our episodes, learning a little bit about the founders, because in the end, great businesses are made up of great people, and they have unique experiences that brought them to where they are. So with that being said, why don't you tell us a little bit about your kind of founder journey, where you come from, and kind of how you got to the place you are today?
Sure. So actually we have something in common, because I actually grew up in a mountain area as well, in the beautiful Black Forest. For the first 18 years of my life, I actually grew up in a hotel restaurant that my family has been running for over 150 years. So I basically have hospitality in my DNA. I swore to myself back then that I don't want to enter this industry. So here I am. After this childhood, I went to WHU. Was pretty much fascinated by the investment banking and consulting industry, like almost everyone there. I was very close to joining Goldman in London in their private equity fund. Had already signed a contract, but then a few months before, we, after Silicon Valley trip, we discovered the business idea for my first company, which is called Kaufda, nowadays better known as Bonial. It's essentially a classifieds business for local shopping, right? So we help shoppers discover weekly offers from grocery retailers, electronics retailers. We work with, the Edekas, the Carrefours, the MediaMarkts of the world. I ran that business for a bit over 9 years. We scaled it to be the market leader in Germany and France with, 25 million users, very nice, profitable business. Sold that then over various stages to the media giant Axel Springer. And 3.5 years ago, I decided to leave operations, and then immediately knew I wanted to build something again, because to me it's one of the most beautiful and intense experiences to build something, a very bold mission with a very driven team. And in between my two companies, I basically also spent a bit of time in just purely doing angel investing, and I like that as well, but I need the adrenaline, and I want to be on the field and actually do, not just, sit on the stadium. I want to, score the goal myself, so to speak. So I rediscovered my hospitality roots, and 3 main things led us to start Numa. And I'm always a big believer that for a business to become big, you need to solve really fundamental problems, right? And the 3 fundamental problems that we're solving in the industry is, one, like from a guest perspective, when you travel nowadays, you either have the choice between the big, boring hotel bunkers or the individual Airbnb host. Now, both have pros and cons, and what we're actually doing is we're combining the best of both worlds, right? So we give you the individuality, the neighborhood experience, that when you go to, Berlin Friedrichshain, that you can live like a person from Friedrichshain, but combined with the standards of a hotel, right? So you know what to expect. You have a quality promise. The second problem that we saw is that the industry is extremely analog, right? So 80%, I think there's a McKinsey study actually that 70% or 80% of the process landscape can be automated. So similar to what Tesla has done in automotive, we're doing in accommodation, right? So we're building a meta technology layer on top of the physical accommodation product with 3 main focus areas. Number 1 is the guest experience. So there's no reception, check-in, check-out works automated. All of you guys know that how annoying it can be to have to wait at the reception for like 15 or 20 minutes, while you could spend that time discovering the neighborhood. We have a virtual concierge that we're working on that gives you curated recommendations, where to eat, what to do, what to experience. Second point, we do things like dynamic pricing, top-line improvements. So what the airline industry has done successfully for decades, we're bringing in a more aggressive way to the hotel industry. And the third is, I would call automation. So For instance, every door is connected to the cloud. And that enables us to also operate much smaller locations than, you know, a big hotel brand. And if you look at the landscape in Europe, about 90% of the supply is smaller than 100 rooms, which is exactly our target range. And they are too small for the big brands to be operated. Now, the third topic, which led us to build the business, is actually a lack of supply. Right? So in many big cities, there has been a huge wave of regulation, and I think rightfully so, because there's a lack of residential apartments. So what city regulators have done to introduce basically a ban, and what we're doing is 100% legally compliant, right? So we reposition commercial real estate or older hotels for this use case, and so that was 2.5 years ago. Fast forward to today, now we have 3,000 units under contract. We're about to be the largest player in Europe, with locations in Berlin, Barcelona, Milano, Rome. And our mission really is to build the most iconic brand in that industry. And it's been an intense ride so far, but I'm very delighted to be on that mission, and it's a nice purpose that we're building there.
Indeed. Maybe you can clarify one thing. You know, this spectrum of hotels on one end and the kind of Airbnb private owners on the other. Yeah. As someone that comes from mountain communities, small mountain communities that have been absolutely, you look at these towns in Colorado where there's only seasonal work, yes. Right? The cost of living has skyrocketed because of the new work opportunities. So people are moving there, buying second homes there. Yeah. And then on top of that, you've got the Airbnb situation going on. Yes. So many of the towns in the region where I come from have tried their best to outlaw it, where they're saying, okay, you can only have short-term rentals for 30 days a month. Yeah. This small town I lived in, Gunnison, 5,000 people, they had dedicated staff that searched the internet and combed Airbnb looking for units to find people, right? So there's a fundamental problem there. On the flip side, sometimes there's not enough hotel stock, but also people don't necessarily want that experience, right? Can you tell me where you guys fit in? I mean, just in terms of the business model too, do you own real estate? Are you contracting? Are you working with individuals? How do the mechanics work there?
Yeah, very good question. So our mission is to be the best and most efficient operator of real estate. So that means we either manage or we lease a building, right? So the two ways basically mean if it's a management model, we basically get a fee that's depending on the revenue and profit we generate for the owners. Or if we provide a lease, then we just pay a fixed or a hybrid lease commitment to the owners. So we ourselves, we're asset light in that sense, so we don't own the real estate ourselves. However, we have just recently announced a partnership with one of the biggest institutional real estate investors called LaSalle, with whom in a separate, it's called a PropCo fund structure, we will also be able to acquire real estate. So that's the technical business model part. Now going back to the range between hotel and Airbnb that you mentioned, if you ask me where will the puck be going in a sports analogy kind of way, in 10 years down the road, the boundaries between what is an Airbnb and what is a hotel room will probably disappear more and more, right? Because ultimately, the target groups that typical hotels and Airbnbs serve will also mix and move in between those more and more. And what's fascinating to see, I think Airbnb 10 years ago was mainly used by people to save money. And now the target group has grown up, has more disposable income, right? And as a consequence, you also see that there's not necessarily a huge price gap in many markets anymore between a hotel and an Airbnb. And ultimately what matters more is what is the experience that you deliver and what is the expectation level of your guests. So as an example, there are two buckets that we think will grow very massively. One is work from anywhere, right? We've all experienced this, but you can't really do this in a normal hotel room that is 15 square meters in size. So you need to have a different product perspective on this, and we're building the product for that use case. And the second component is that people might travel less, but then stay longer, right? They want to have a bit of a democratic experience in a sense of, I want to be able to make my own breakfast. I don't need to go into the hotel gym, which is often not that great, right? So I rather want to have the recommendation where to go in the neighborhood. And that's the new spirit in travel, which we're building the supply for, basically.
So one of the words that pops in my head when I hear this a little bit, and it's one of maybe my critiques of, and I'm an Airbnb user and I'm a hotel user and I travel a ton, but it's curation, yes. Right? It's like creating these kind of curated experiences. When you go to an Airbnb, you're kind of subject to, here's a space, go figure it out, right? In a hotel, you're kind of in the hamster wheel of the same, very little flexibility of choice. If I understand correctly, you're almost working on creating an experience rather than an accommodation.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, so that's a very good point that you're uncovering. So for now, of course, we're very focused on delivering an excellent accommodation experience, right? That's the foundation. And ultimately, I always like to say that we're building three businesses at the same time, right? So you have the real estate part of the business, you have the technology part of it, but then you have the lifestyle component of it, right? And when someone stays in your property for, let's say 3 days or an entire week, you have an amazing opportunity to make them discover additional things, right? So go to that nice breakfast cafe around the corner, which, is, off the beaten TripAdvisor track. Our experts have discovered that. Or you should try this and that activity. That's where I see us going. We're not there yet because we're very focused on the accommodation experience, but I'm a big fan of looking at this from a guest journey standpoint and then understand how many touch points you have. I mean, that's basically what many great tech companies have done in e-commerce or in the music industry, right? And if you transfer that philosophy to accommodation, I think is insanely powerful. I also think that what you mentioned regarding hotels or Airbnbs, there's so much search cost involved, right? I see it myself when I'm, about to travel. I always am, of course, I've gotten very picky, but the amount of time that you invest to find the right spot for you, it's very long. And we try to reduce that by curating the experience. We want to give you a local vibe, but with the quality level of a hotel. Right.
Yeah, it's, I think you have an interesting analog in place too, because Airbnb, they've invested pretty heavily in this experiences side of things. And yes. At least from the consumer standpoint, looking at it, it seems like a sunk cost that hasn't really, I feel like they could have done that so much more better by, instead of just saying, here are experiences in a place and here's accommodations in a place, tying those two things together more effectively.
Yeah, I think it's still early days for them, but I think overall, from my perspective, it's quite impressive how they approach the whole guest journey. And I think they're really obsessed with it. I mean, I think Brian Chesky, the Airbnb founder, got the inspiration after reading the Walt Disney biography, I think, if I remember correctly. So I agree with you, it's still early, but the potential for this is huge, right? And I can definitely understand why they're pushing for this. But if you look at it in a comparison to us, right? I mean, Airbnb is the facilitator ultimately, but when you have someone that's actually staying in your premises for a certain amount of time, you have a lot more opportunities, and also should look at it that way, to help and to facilitate, these type of experiences. Right. Yeah. But also expectation management, it's not easy because tastes are so different. But I think, with technology, if you look ahead in 5 or 10 years, there's so much you can do, and which would also provide us with additional revenue opportunities and ultimately the possibility to create delight, and make guests happy, right, and give them a smile.
Right. I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about this from the entrepreneur's perspective, sure, because I think it's a really interesting business and in some ways a bit of a challenging one, right? Taking the kind of owning the real estate out of the equation, yeah, for the time being, in a way, you're kind of a two-sided marketplace with additional services in there. Of course, you've got customers, which are the end users, the travelers, and then you have customers that are leveraging your technology that might be these property owners or hotel owners. Can you share a little bit about what your target customer, what your kind of, or at least early adopting or ideal customer looks like, and maybe a little bit about the classic startup experience of what comes first, the chicken or the egg, and how you kind of manage those things?
Sure. So for the first part of your question, so if you look at the guest side, the demand side, our average guest is 35 years old, which is, by the way, from a German perspective, 14 years younger than the average hotel guest, right? So we always like to say that, we serve the travelers that will dominate the next 10 to 20 years in travel, right? So the millennials and the Gen Z generation. That don't want to stay in a typical hotel. And about 70% of our travel use case is leisure, so not business driven. We're slowly moving more into business, but I think leisure will always play the dominating part. On the supply side, we have 3 main categories to keep it very simple. Number 1 are like smaller individual owners who have maybe 1 or a few buildings. Often in the past, they probably operated it themselves. Then 2 is family offices that are much more professional, right? Have a significant amount of real estate. And then 3, developers that work with us to transform buildings from their traditional historic use cases, let's say an office or a hostel, into the Numa use case. And these are the 3 main target groups. Now, to your chicken and egg question, of course, that's the holy grail. In our business, the initial bottleneck is the supply side. So, right, how do you get to the physical product? And since I'm very well versed with solving chicken egg issues, that was basically one of the main challenges in my previous business as well, with large retail organizations who are very conservative, similar to the real estate owners. You just have to understand what's important to them, right? So number 1, of course, they're very risk averse. And we were fortunate to start a few months before COVID hit, but we used it as a massive opportunity, and we built up a lot of proof points that our model is very strong even in a bad demand environment. So we managed to deliver 85% in occupancy over last year and similar numbers in the year before, because we have different use cases that we can interact on the demand side. So towards the real estate partners, we could deliver a lot of trust and confidence that whatever happens in the market, we're always able to meet our obligations and our demand. And that's a unique opportunity. And that basically accelerated our development on the supply side massively, because, in a crisis environment, and I also started my first company in a crisis, right, in 2008, it's much easier for you to shine and to show everyone what you're doing differently, right? And in the hotel industry, pre-COVID, it was almost like, whatever you did, if you had, even not that great places, made a fortune in some of the cities we're in because of the lack of supply. So yeah, we were just like really disciplined and focused on a clear execution quality, and then understand also, how you need to approach and address those real estate partners. And I think, yeah, we cracked that formula quite nicely.
When I work with a lot of startups, I work with a ton of startups, and occasionally I get this, we're a B2B2C, and I understand what everyone's saying, but I don't really like that term. And the reason I don't like that term is because in reality, it just means you have two sales fronts. It's almost two different entities with two different value propositions, right? Yeah. You've got the B2B, in your case, B2B/enterprise sales, which requires a different type of sales process, a different type of people leading that sales process, different KPIs. You're dealing with sales cycles rather than CAC and some of those traditional metrics. And then you've got the more what people think of on the B2C side, probably digital heavy. You're looking at completely different metrics altogether. Taking you back a couple years before you kind of reached product market fit. I always find that can be super challenging for a startup, because you kind of need more people or you need more bodies. How did you handle having to, in your early stages, having to tackle two sales fronts kind of simultaneously? Did it mean you had to scale faster and require more capital, or did you find innovative ways to manage that? Or did you do all the work yourself, which a lot of founders end up doing?
Great question. So, I mean, first of all, I'm very fortunate to have three amazing co-founders in the business, right, who each of them are more or less responsible for the three main business drivers that I initially mentioned, right? So Inga, who is in charge of the brand and lifestyle part, Swedish by background, who has a very strong brand and design acumen. And second, Gerrit, who built a fintech FX hedging company before, who runs the tech side of the business. And then Dimitri, who comes from real estate and private equity, who runs the real estate side of the business. So I focused very early on to build a team that covers all these critical success factors, right? Because there are a few things that I do very well, but many more that I don't do that well, right? And it's important to have this self-reflection. So I focused on that initially. And then ultimately, to go back to your question, so if you look at the demand side, yes, that is very similar to what you see in e-commerce, in mobile gaming, or in my previous more like classifieds-driven industry, where you need to be very data-driven, you need to understand the guest journey. So that was my background, right? So I had an unfair advantage, so to speak, because in my previous company, you were competing with. It was mostly app-driven, so 90% of our business was app-based, and it's the cutthroat competition for user attention, right? And if you apply that philosophy to demand generation in the hotel industry, it's actually a lot easier, in my opinion. Although some of the hotel industry players would probably disagree with me, but so that was actually, I think, fairly simple for us, but mostly because we had the background, so we also knew what kind of team members we need to hire and what qualities and traits to look for. And then you need to experiment a lot and be very adaptive. COVID for almost 2 years didn't really allow us to plan more than 2 weeks ahead. I think now from March onwards, it's a very different scenario. And you can see it in the data. It's very nice to see that the initial groundwork we did now really pays off. And then on the supply side, I think, yes, you're right. This enterprise sales analogy, I think, is a very nice description of it. Initially, I think the bottleneck here is just that you need to build up your track record, right? So, and then get from, one deal to the next, and then think of it basically similar to how, B2B enterprise sales software companies design their funnel. And that's what we're doing as well, right? And I think it was not really a matter of more money or more investment, because ultimately it's more of a question like, how do you get a partner over the finish line, in a sense of, yes, I trust you with managing a building that's worth 50 million euros or 100 million euros, and I have a loan of 40 million or 80 million euros on it, so you better don't fuck it up. Yeah. I think we just provided a good playbook and gave them the confidence that, hey, look at the worst crisis since World War II in that industry, which was driven by COVID. These guys delivered 85% in occupancy, which is 3 to 4x of what the rest of the industry is doing. and you can trust them, right? So that's basically very simple ultimately. And you have to understand that in our industry, it's not just the real estate partners, but often, they need to report or get the buy-in from the banks or financing partners that finance those buildings for them. I mean, it's an industry that works with a lot of leverage, and we're very fortunate to have a team that is very strong in that area. Yeah.
So I had an enterprise SaaS startup, and we raised plenty of money, but it took pretty much a year and a half to get our first enterprise client up and running. Yeah. It took almost a year from first touch to operations. Now we had technical integrations and other things. For you guys, did you land like one cornerstone, property company? Was it a long process before you could get up and running, or were you able to hack that some way and get going faster?
Yeah, great question. So we actually, we were quite fast because we landed our very first lighthouse building in the middle of Prenzlauer Berg in Berlin very quickly. So, we signed the deal, I think, 2 months after we had launched the company, and then it went live 1.5 months later. I'm very fortunate that we managed to get this deal. It was not a huge building, right? But it's still to this day an iconic place with very strong performance metrics. And this basically, I think, cut our development time almost by 9 or 10 months, because then it's live, you can use it as a showcase. The performance metrics were strong. It's Berlin, Prenzlauer Berg. There's lots of chains all over the world who have been trying to get into the market for 20 years and have failed to do so, and that created then an initial momentum on which we could build on. And, I was quite sure. We had some discussions initially because, back then the deal might have been expensive. In hindsight, I think it's a fair deal for us. But that, we just have to get started and solve the chicken egg issue. And that was our approach to do so.
I want to go back to something you said that I think was really poignant. And it's when you mentioned your co-founders. Yes. Maybe it's a VHU thing, maybe it's just a young person thing, but I see so many early stage ventures that are centered around an idea or an opportunity. Yeah, there's a problem attached, but it's an opportunity. And oftentimes it's not the right founders for that opportunity. The founder market fit isn't necessarily there. I hear the structure of your team, real estate, tech, design, your hotel background. Was this a process that you undertook looking for those characteristics? And maybe you could share a little bit how that team came together, because I think so many founders, that's their dream scenario, is to be able to cherry pick and find just the right people for this problem that you're tackling.
Yeah, for sure. You're mentioning, I think, a super critical point, right? The founder market or founder product fit, which is also something that I pay a lot of attention to when we do our angel investment activities, right? But so it was not the only business that I looked into, right? So I also looked into the insurance market and the banking market because I'm fascinated by those. But to me, I asked myself, okay, me personally, first of all and foremost, what is the best fit for me, right? And ultimately, when you start a business, you can never anticipate all the challenges and black swans that will be waiting for you. And it was the same case for us, right? COVID, I think probably many founders would have said like, okay, I'm going to stop now. It's too intense. But if you don't have the perseverance for it, in other words, you need to love what you're doing, then you will not go through that wave of, and let's be honest, 70 to 80% of building a company is frustration and overcoming it. It's the 10 to 20% that is really, the shiny bright light and, the rainbows. So you have to love that. And that's why I said to myself, okay, this is really a great fit for me, because I know from my childhood, but also it's something that I like and it matches my strength areas. Now, when it comes to building our founder team, it was pretty clear that, we had these three components that are represented in my co-founders as major success factors. So brand, real estate, tech. It would add a fourth one, which is financing. And then fifth is the operations part, right? So to deliver really excellent execution quality. The other two we have basically covered now with leadership team members. But I think that's very critical that you reflect on this, because a lot of teams are just either too strong on one part of the business, or they don't spend enough time on, am I actually the right founder for this? I mean, a very common example is, if the business involves a lot of sales, right, and you don't have a commercial animal on your team, that's a big red flag. And that's the same way how also investors will look at it, right? And ultimately, you shouldn't fool yourself, because again, 80% is overcoming frustration. So if you're not ready for this, you will have lots of nightmares in that context. So I think it's very important.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested to hear, you built companies almost a decade apart. Yeah. I've recently launched a new venture. I'm getting close to 2 decades. But what I've discovered is the more experience, the older I've gotten, the easier it's become for me to cherry pick and find those, great co-founders and great partners. When I was younger, it was like calling my friends, like, who's not doing anything? I need help, kind of thing, trying to wrestle together anyone that would believe my crazy vision. Have you noticed in your kind of second iteration or second successful iteration of being a founder, how your experience has changed?
Yeah, 100%. It's a great topic. So, I mean, first of all, in the 10 years before, I've made so many mistakes, right? So I can avoid them, now I can do new mistakes. But joking aside, I think you have a much better reflection on what you need on your team, because you have more time to identify and reflect on your own weaknesses, right? And you should ideally complement that in your team. And that was for me the starting point, right? Number one. Number two is to really understand also what you need to have in a co-founder or even in senior leadership team members for them to be able to endure over a long journey of 10 years, right? And that's mostly in the early days, is like, how are they able to deal with frustration? What really motivates them? And if you have a extended period of 6-12 months where you just bang your head against the wall because you get to hear no 100 times, like, will they try to jump over the wall for the 101st time? Yeah. And I'm very fortunate to have that, but there were also, signs for this in their previous careers, right? So, Inga, who has worked in investment banking for a long time, Gerrit, who built his own startup before, and Dimitri, who has basically been in a very high pressure private equity environment for a very long time, right? So I'm always getting skeptical if people are doing something only for half a year or a year and then do something new. So I want to see that stamina and the perseverance, and that was very important to me, among many other things.
It's interesting that you talk about like stamina and perseverance, because I think a lot about young Gerrit founder versus older Gerrit founder. Yes. And I think it was Michael Jordan that used to talk about this, but a number of athletes talk about when they get into the professional leagues, everything is moving so fast, right? Everybody's faster, everything's going at a crazy pace. And over time, the game starts to slow down, right? And they see things unfolding that they wouldn't have seen in their early stages. I feel like that analogy works very much as an entrepreneur. Your first journey it's fucking chaos, right? You're just like, well, I don't know what to do next. Like, you know, what do? I just work longer. I work harder. You know, I stay up later, whatever it might be. And once you've gone down this road a few times, the game seems to, at least for me, seems to slow down a little bit and make a lot more sense, and enables me to be more deliberate in my action. Do you find you're on your second quite successful venture? Do you see you as a founder different now than you did previously?
Yeah, I love what you said about the perceived speed in your own perspective, and I would love to hear more about what you just said. But from my experience, you know, in my previous company, when I started, you know, it was always high adrenaline, super quick reaction, like everything had to be done immediately. And then over time, I had to learn, like, you know, also to manage my own energy a lot better, right? So I'm doing, for like about 4 years now, I'm doing like daily meditation rituals. If you had told me that 10 years ago, I would have told you, like, what the fuck? No, I have no chance. Yeah. Like, I'm not one of those, you know, people who need that. But ultimately, I realized that it increases my performance by 20 or 30%. And I think ultimately, since you've seen so many semi-apocalyptic moments when people around you think, you know, the world is crashing upon you, you can just react much calmer. And you know, and I'm a big fan of a book called Extreme Ownership. I'm sure you know it, right? So the Navy SEALs, and one of their principles is relax, take a look around, make a call whenever a crisis happens. And that also helped us get, for instance, through COVID in a, I would say, very smooth way. But yeah, 100%. And I mean, ultimately, that's just the value of experience, but also, you know, you need to force yourself to develop that calm sense of, you know, how do I manage myself, and then how do I manage the company? Because I think the intensity and the emotions that you show will be reflected in the organization immediately. Yeah.
This topic of energy balance is really interesting to me. I mean, I pretty much did a lot of my PhD research on this, but my one venture that was fast, catastrophic failure was right after an exit, I jumped right back on the horse.
No pause?
I mean, a few months.
Yeah, but that's nothing.
And it was just, I was a train wreck. I just didn't have the energy and that intrinsic drive to really like unlock all the challenges along the way. And eventually I just said, and it probably had some legs, and I just didn't have the drive to do it, you know? And then I took a good 5 years off and kind of, you know, re-energized and was ready to go again. Were you deliberate in that 3-year break that you had? Because at first, if you had asked me this 10 years ago, I would have been like, 3 years, that's a long time. If you ask me now, I'll say, 3 years, is that long enough? You know?
Yeah, just for the record, it was only 1 year in between, but still quite a substantial time. And, you know, ultimately, I mean, this is something that everyone has to answer her himself, right? So what I did, I spent a lot of time in the US and Brazil as part of my previous company, but I didn't really spend almost any time in Asia. So I went like a month to China, a month to Japan to just experience society, the industry, the tech industry, etc. And then, you know, I didn't force myself, like in a sense of setting a deadline, of creating evaluation spreadsheets, you know, what opportunity is the best to pursue next. It's more like, you know, you feel it when the time is right. Probably that's, you know, would be curious to hear how you felt it then after 5 years. But that's just, you know, it's like this inner conviction that you need to build up. And I'm not a big fan of, you know, you sit in front of a spreadsheet, which some people do, right? And then grade like all the opportunities on a scale, and then ultimately there's a number at the bottom, and that's what I'm going to do. I think that doesn't work, right? Yeah. So
yeah, it's you're probably like me. Like, I have no shortage of new venture ideas. Like, yes. I can't take a shower without coming up with a new startup idea. And for me, I have to kind of like park them and put them away, yes. and try to forget about them. Yes. And every once in a while, there's one that just keeps coming back and won't let go. And I call it the itch that I need to scratch, right? And then eventually, yeah. after time, it becomes more and more evident that this is something that's driving me to, yeah. do it, you know? But I think oftentimes people will just come up with an idea. They think, yeah. that this is my idea, and get attached to it, you know? And the Buddhists, actually, I think the concept of non-attachment, right, is a great practice for an entrepreneur. Is like, don't get attached to a vision or an idea. It's okay, maybe get attached to a problem, you know, but make sure that that's the problem that is going to get you up every day, yeah. and enjoying the journey of trying to solve.
Yes. Yeah, especially the last point that you mentioned, like enjoying the building part, right? I think that you need to have an addition for the passion for the specific business, but I think the building part is probably almost equally important, right? Yeah, but I think there's only one way to figure it out, and I think what I observe in the industry is that for many first-time founders, the issue is then to deal with the fact that there would have been so many other ideas that I theoretically could have pursued. But, you know, now you need to be laser focused on the one thing, and, you know, there's a few other news items popping up, and you can't really get distracted by that. Yeah, so.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, the ideas are the easy part. It's the execution that's, yes. that separates the entrepreneurs from the wantrepreneurs, as Mark Cuban says.
Yes,
yeah.
100%.
Yeah. So, because we have an audience of many people from your alma mater, and many of them are aspiring founders, the next generation is looking pretty strong, in my estimation. As someone that's, you know, been through this ringer a few times, I think you're now qualified to impart some wisdom. So,
happy to, if it helps. Yeah.
What advice would you give to someone, you know, maybe coming out of their bachelor's or master's and saying, I don't want to do the corporate thing. I want to be a lone cowboy and build my first venture. What kind of advice would you share?
What advice would I share? So number one is start as soon as possible. The longer you wait, you know, the less healthy naivete you have, and the more concerns will pop up in your head. And in the beginning, this nice mix between a slight overconfidence and a bit of naivete is quite helpful, because, you know, you're not listening to the naysayers, and you need that a little bit. And number two is, if you're talking about risk, you don't really have much risk, right? And whenever I hear this, it's like, yeah, you know, we're taking this and that risk. And in reality, especially in a startup, you know, where you get outside funding, you don't carry any risk. Yeah. So the theoretical risk that you have is foregone salary, but hey, in my opinion, that's not really any risk compared to, you know, some of the Mittelstand entrepreneurs that started 50 years ago that were levered up until their nose with bank loans. So that's number two. Number three is, I would really, like I said earlier, try to reflect on what are my personal strengths and weaknesses, and then be very honest to yourself, right? Because there's no point in, you know, let's take an example, like, of course, you know, it's nice to be the shiny commercial animal, because you might get more exposure, let's say, to the outside world. But if you're, let's say, more an introvert and, you know, focus more on, let's say, building a fantastic product, etc. And fourth, I would just like really early on spend enough time to think about who do I want to build this with. I mean, if you're on your own, great. I have a lot of respect for that. I would never be able to do that. Most and foremost, because of the emotional roller coaster that you need to go through, and it's always nice to share this with someone else than your own brain, ultimately then just go out and do it, right? I mean, you can spend a lot of time thinking behind screens and the scenes, but ultimately it's about doing the first step and then start from there. I think the beauty of our university is actually that there have been so many success stories now, and even the ones that did not work out so well, the people who have done this are following that have either had fantastic other opportunities or built another great company. So I think that should give everyone a lot of courage that it's the right thing to do if you're interested in that.
Yeah, I always say get your failures out of the way while you're young, because the chances are you're going to need to fail a few times to get it right. If you look at the numbers, statistically, successfully exited entrepreneurs in their 40s have already done this a few times and have been working for 10 or 15 years, so. That's
actually true. I think in the US and in Silicon Valley, I think the average founder age is significantly higher than here. I think we will get there. Yeah. But it's a very important point that you mentioned, right? This failure tolerance, and people who have failed at least once or twice before will just have a much higher, in my opinion, success probability, because you've already banged your head against the wall and felt it, right?
Just don't fuck up the same way twice, right? learn from your mistakes.
Yeah, but get up again, and it's like I said, what is the real risk, even if it fails? I mean, I think the failure culture also in Germany has improved a lot, right, compared to 10, 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Thank goodness. Yeah. That's really, really important.
Yeah.
All right. 2 rapid fire questions to wrap things up that nobody likes, but I do it anyway. So, number 1, can learn a lot about someone by what they read.
Yeah.
Do you have a book recommendation? Is there something on your bedside table that you're reading?
So I'm not a big reader, disclaimer, but what I am trying to read at the moment is a book about FC Barcelona called FC Barça, because I'm just fascinated about the Catalan and Barcelona culture, and to see how our sports club is being run and what kind of inspiration we can take from there. How they, just as one anecdote, I mean, I didn't know that it was basically a Dutchman, Johan Cruyff, who built the initial success of FC Barça, and that while the wisdom back then was, you can only hire players that are 185 in centimeters or taller. He was the first one to change that, and that's when players like Messi and Iniesta were recruited into their youth academy. So it's just very fascinating to me.
I have a little bit of a bitterness right now as an FC Bayern fan. I'm not particularly happy with what Barca's doing right now. They're going to steal away my favorite player.
I can imagine. But I'm not a Barca fan in itself. For the sake of my mother is Italian, I should probably cheer for Juve. No, it's just, to me, I like looking at sports in general to get some inspiration on what we can improve, because I think there are some similarities. It's a high pressure environment, similar to what we're facing in the business world. And so I can recommend that. Generally, another book that I read was, I forgot the name, but since you mentioned him earlier, the former personal coach of Air Jordan, of Michael Jordan.
Yeah. I just listened to a great podcast episode with him, his performance coach.
Yes, his performance coach. He is the same coach also for Kobe Bryant and a few others. And one of the main takeaways for me was that apparently Michael Jordan built so many routines into his day. He was very obsessed with that because, he wanted to reduce the amount of decisions that he had to take so he can spend more brain power while being on the basketball court. So just as one example, even the routine how to tie his shoes. I don't know how you call the Schnürsenkel in English. I apologize, but you get what I mean. So even that had to be on point, and I've just found that fascinating because I think building routines is an important part of the founder story in business.
And decision fatigue, right? Like we only have so much brain capacity to make hard decisions. Yes. And I think Albert Einstein recognized that earliest on. He had a closet of all the same suits. He always wore the same thing every day. And you saw it with Steve Jobs or even with Zuckerberg. Yes. And a lot of great leaders say, let's cut out the unimportant stuff so I can use my brain power for the most important stuff, or my physical power in the case of Jordan. Yeah.
Great analogy. But so that's another one I can recommend. Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
And the last one is, let's talk about your musical tastes a little bit. Our last guest, I know I made a little bit uncomfortable, poor Jochen, when he cautiously admitted that he loved Berlin rap, which personally I do too. So what great embarrassing music is on your playlist?
Yeah, so I have to admit that I'm a big fan of house music, and actually, fun thing for you, I between my two companies, I participated in a 1-week music management workshop actually that was run by the former manager of Swedish House Mafia and Kanye West in London. It was also very fascinating to see the ins and outs of that. But no, so in terms of podcasts, I don't listen much to actual content podcasts because I'm dealing with business matters enough in a typical day. But I'm right now, what I really like is listening to the podcasts of, in English, you would probably call him Vintage Culture. He's probably the most famous house artist in Brazil. They call him more Vintage. I hope I pronounced it correctly. And I've been to a few of his events in Brazil. I'm a big fan of the country. And so that's what I try to, put a little bit of focus away from business matters. And it's a big fan of him. Yeah.
Well, I'm throwing in one extra question because you kind of primed it perfectly, which is you said you're a big fan of Brazil. Yes. You told me offline you're also a big fan of Sweden.
Yeah, Sweden for sure. Yeah, I mean, Sweden is to me a very idyllic place. I've been there, I can't even count anymore, like 130 times. Loved the society. It's probably the most forward-thinking society. The style. My better half is from Sweden. I have a half Swedish son now who is 1 year old. So I love the place a lot. Like I said, it's a bit idyllic, sometimes too idyllic, a bit like a fairy tale, I think, because everything is working so smoothly there. It's to me a big inspiration.
Do you have some other places in the world that you would like to see Numa next? I imagine, this is obviously a great business, but it has that nice little hint of lifestyle business in it too, where you get to experience some great places and some great things.
Yeah, so I mean, from a business perspective, we're of course very focused on Europe because that's actually one of the few things or one of the few industries in which Europe is actually leading the world because we have so many old things, right? More than anywhere else in the world. And but if you ask me like long term, if I could dream, like where would I like to be, probably ties back to where I had my best own travel experiences, right? So, and I'm not saying we will go there, but just like theoretically, long term, the time I spent in Japan was super fascinating. The discipline and the attention to detail in that country is just like amazing. And then the other very fascinating trip I made was actually already in 2007 with some of my WHU classmates, Israel. You know, again here very different, but the sense of urgency, the massive melting pot of influences was very inspiring as well. And then there's, you know, hundreds of other places, of course, but I think it's easy to make a mistake in our business to just go where you know you would like to be, but we were very focused on Europe.
Sure. You know, that's the thing about travel is people that don't do it think that when you go somewhere, you can check it off the list. But every time you go somewhere, you just add 10 more places to the list that you didn't get to see, you know?
Yeah, actually with me, my friends usually make fun of me because, you know, whenever I discovered something that I like, I just want to go back there a lot, right? So Sweden is a good example.
And dig deeper. And, get more local.
Yeah, to have this feeling of being like almost your second home. And I have a few places in Brazil where, you know, I would say that I know quite well. So maybe as a funny side business, I should create some entertainment tour company. But it's not a good business to be in, I guess.
But Brazilian house music, hey, there's always a side hustle there somewhere. But for sure. Man, Christian, thank you so much. Like I feel like I'm wrapping this up with more questions and more things I would love to ask you, but we'll have to save it for the next time when Numa has dominated the world, and I will beg you to join us again. But
that's a good motivation for us, and that shall be our mission. Gerrit, it's been great fun. Enjoyed it, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Cheers, mate. Well, folks, that was Christian Gaiser, co-founder of Numa. Stay tuned. In a few weeks, we've got a collection of tremendous founders and entrepreneurs on our next episodes. Until then, if you like this episode, please feel free to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, leave us a review on Spotify, and if you didn't like the episode very much, please just skip that part. Bis nächstes Mal.